I never should have survived that day. Sometimes I wonder if I did. The jungle was still, the kind of quiet that settles in just before something terrible happens. The thick canopy overhead blocked out most of the sunlight, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist with every step I took. My heart pounded in my chest, every beat a painful reminder that I was still alive, unlike the others. I hadn't spoken about Jonestown in years. The memories were buried deep, locked away in a place I thought they could never escape from. But here I was, back in this cursed jungle, drawn by something I couldn't explain. A need to confront the past, or maybe to finally understand what really happened that day. As I walked, the remnants of the compound came into view, overgrown and decayed, yet still eerily recognizable. The skeletons of the makeshift huts, the rusting remains of the commune's vehicles, and the empty, hollowed-out buildings all stood as silent witnesses to the horrors that had unfolded here. My breath caught in my throat as I approached the central pavilion, the place where they all died. Over 900 souls, gone in a single day. The air was thick with the stench of death. Even after all these years, I could almost hear them, the faint echoes of their screams, the desperate pleas for salvation that never came. I stopped at the edge of the pavilion, my eyes drawn to the spot where the vats of poison had been. The ground was still stained, the earth permanently tainted by the cyanide-laced punch that had claimed so many lives. I could see it all so clearly, the bodies piled on top of each other, faces frozen in twisted masks of agony. The horror of it all hit me like a wave, threatening to pull me under. But then, something strange happened. The air around me grew colder, and the shadows seemed to deepen, dark tendrils creeping towards me as if they were alive. My heart raced as I scanned the area, every nerve in my body screaming that I wasn't alone. A rustling sound came from behind one of the dilapidated huts. I froze, my breath hitching as I turned slowly, my eyes wide with fear. There was nothing there. Just the jungle, thick and oppressive, pressing in on all sides. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move forward, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. The rustling came again, this time closer, followed by the sound of soft, shuffling footsteps. I whipped around, my heart slamming against my ribs, but again, nothing. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, just a shadow at first, barely distinguishable from the darkness around it. But as it moved closer, the outline became clearer. A woman, her hair matted and her clothes tattered, her face a ghastly white. Her eyes were wide, vacant, and her mouth hung open as if frozen in a silent scream. My blood ran cold as I recognized her. She had been one of the followers, a woman I had known well, someone who had shared the same hopes and dreams as the rest of us. But now, she was something else. Something not quite alive, yet not fully dead. She was a ghost, a lingering soul unable to move on, trapped in this place of eternal torment. Before I could react, she lunged at me, her hands outstretched, fingers like claws reaching for my throat. I stumbled back, tripping over a root and falling hard to the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and for a moment I was sure she would take me, drag me back into the darkness with her. But when I looked up, she was gone, vanished as if she had never been there. The only sound was the pounding of my heart and the ragged gasps of my breath. I scrambled to my feet, my hands trembling uncontrollably. I knew I had to get out of there, but the path back seemed to have disappeared. The jungle had closed in around me, the trees and vines twisting together to form an impenetrable wall. Then I heard it. A whisper, soft and chilling, carried on the wind. "You shouldn't have come back." It was his voice. Jim Jones, the voice of the man who had led us all to our doom. But he was dead. I had seen his body myself, slumped over in his chair, a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. Or had I? The jungle grew darker, the shadows more oppressive, as the whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent. My head throbbed with the sound, my vision blurring as the memories I had tried so hard to forget came flooding back. And then, out of the darkness, more figures began to appear. Men, women, and children, all of them with the same vacant eyes and pale, lifeless faces. They were all there, every single one of them. The lost souls of Jonestown, rising from the grave to confront the one who had escaped. I stumbled back, my mind racing with panic, trying to make sense of what was happening. But there was no escape, no way out. They closed in around me, their eyes empty, their mouths moving silently as if trying to speak. And then, in unison, they screamed. A high-pitched, blood-curdling wail that pierced the very core of my being. I clamped my hands over my ears, falling to my knees as the sound overwhelmed me. But it was no use. Their screams filled my head, drowning out all rational thought, leaving me with nothing but sheer, unbridled terror. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the screaming stopped. I opened my eyes, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The figures were gone, the jungle silent once more. But the sense of dread remained, a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. I knew then that I wasn't alone. I had never been alone. The spirits of Jonestown had followed me, haunted me, and they wouldn't rest until they had taken what was theirs. I staggered to my feet, my body trembling, and looked around the clearing. The shadows seemed to be closing in again, darker and more menacing than before. I had to get out, had to find a way to escape this nightmare before it consumed me completely. But as I turned to leave, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was Jim Jones himself. His eyes locked on mine, a twisted smile playing on his lips. His voice echoed in my mind, that same calm, commanding tone that had once led so many to their deaths. "You can never leave, you know. You're one of us now." I tried to move, to run, but my legs refused to obey. The jungle seemed to close in around me, the shadows creeping closer, and the cold grip of fear took hold. And then, with a sudden violent force, everything went black. When consciousness returned, I found myself lying on the cold, hard ground, my body stiff and aching. The oppressive darkness surrounded me, and for a moment I was sure I had been buried alive, trapped in some suffocating tomb of dirt and roots. Panic clawed at my throat, and I tried to move, but my limbs were heavy, weighed down by an invisible force. Then a dim light flickered in the distance, barely more than a spark, but enough to pierce the inky blackness around me. I focused on it, willing my body to move, to crawl toward that faint glimmer of hope. As I inched closer, the light grew brighter, revealing the outlines of trees and the dense undergrowth of the jungle. The cold ground beneath me shifted to damp earth, and the air grew thick with the scent of decaying vegetation. The realization that I was still in the jungle, a place that had become a living nightmare, hit me like a blow to the chest. But something was different. The atmosphere had changed, becoming even more sinister, more malevolent. The air crackled with an unseen energy, charged with a deep, pulsing hatred that seemed to seep into my very bones. I reached the source of the light, a small, flickering flame, no larger than a candle. It floated in the air, suspended by some unseen force, casting eerie shadows that danced and writhed around me. As I stared at it, transfixed, the flame suddenly flared, growing larger and brighter until it became a blazing inferno, forcing me to shield my eyes. When the light finally dimmed, I found myself standing in the center of a large clearing. The jungle had receded, the trees forming a dense, impenetrable wall around me. But what caught my attention was the ground. No longer the damp, moss-covered earth of the jungle, but instead a hard, cracked surface, as if scorched by fire. And there, in the center of the clearing, was the pavilion. But it wasn't the decaying, overgrown structure I had seen before. It was as it had been on that day, the day of the massacre, intact, pristine, and filled with people. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I recognized the figures standing around the pavilion. They were the followers, the men, women, and children who had died that day. But they weren't just standing. They were reenacting the events of that fateful day, as if caught in some nightmarish loop, doomed to relive their final moments for all eternity. I watched in horror as they lined up one by one to receive the poisoned drink, their faces blank, eyes hollow. Mothers fed their children the deadly poison, their hands shaking as they coaxed the liquid down their throats. Fathers held their families close, tears streaming down their faces as they whispered words of comfort that rang hollow in the face of death. And there, standing at the front of the pavilion, was Jim Jones himself. He was just as I remembered him, tall, imposing, his dark glasses hiding the madness in his eyes. He held a microphone in one hand, his voice echoing across the clearing, filled with that same charismatic power that had drawn so many to him. "It's the only way," he said, his voice calm, soothing. "We must transcend this world, leave behind the pain and suffering. We will be free in death." The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices low and subdued like a congregation under a spell. They believed him, every word, every lie. And they followed him, straight into the grave. My stomach churned with a mix of fear and disgust as I watched the scene unfold. This was no mere memory, no replay of past events. This was something far worse, an echo of the past, fueled by the restless spirits of those who had died here. They were trapped, caught in an endless cycle of death, and I was forced to witness it, powerless to stop it. But as I stood there, something strange began to happen. The figures started to change, their faces twisting and distorting, becoming grotesque caricatures of themselves. Their skin turned a sickly gray, their eyes sunken and lifeless, and their mouths stretched into unnatural grins that exposed rows of jagged, broken teeth. They were no longer human. They had become something else, something monstrous. And then they turned to me, every single one of them, their hollow eyes locking onto mine, their grins widening as they slowly began to advance. I could see the malice in their gaze, the hatred that burned within them, directed solely at me. "Join us," they whispered, their voices low and raspy like nails on a chalkboard. "Join us in death." I took a step back, my heart racing as the horde of twisted, nightmarish figures closed in around me. Their hands reached out, fingers like claws, scraping against my skin as they tried to pull me into their ranks, to make me one of them. Panic surged through me and I turned to run, but the ground beneath me cracked and split open, revealing a gaping chasm filled with darkness. I stumbled, nearly falling into the abyss, but managed to catch myself at the last moment, teetering on the edge. The creatures were right behind me, their grins widening as they sensed my fear, my desperation. I had nowhere to go, nowhere to run. I was trapped, but then a voice, soft, barely a whisper, broke through the chaos. "Don't give in, fight." I looked up, my eyes scanning the crowd of monstrous figures, searching for the source of the voice. It was familiar, but I couldn't place it. And then, out of the darkness, a figure emerged. A woman, her face obscured by shadows, but her presence unmistakable. She reached out to me, her hand glowing with a soft, ethereal light. "Take my hand, trust me." I hesitated, the fear gripping me tight, but something in her voice, something pure and reassuring, gave me the strength to move. I reached out, my hand trembling as I grasped hers. The moment our hands touched, the darkness around us shattered, the creatures recoiling with screams of agony as the light from the woman's hand grew brighter, forcing them back. But it wasn't over. The ground beneath me continued to crack and crumble, the chasm widening as it threatened to swallow me whole. I clung to the woman's hand, my heart pounding in my chest as I fought to stay above the abyss. "You have to let go of the past," the woman said, her voice calm but urgent. "It's the only way to escape." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. I can't forget what happened." She tightened her grip, her eyes, now visible, filled with both compassion and determination. "You don't have to forget, but you must forgive yourself. You survived for a reason. You have to live." Her words struck something deep within me, a part of me that had been buried under years of guilt and fear. And in that moment I realized she was right. I had been clinging to the past, letting it consume me, letting it keep me trapped in this nightmare. But now I had a choice. I could let go. I could live. With a deep breath, I let go of the guilt, the fear, the anger that had held me captive for so long. And as I did, the chasm below me began to close, the ground solidifying once more. The woman smiled, a warm, reassuring smile, and pulled me to my feet. The creatures had vanished, the darkness receded, and the clearing was empty once more. But I knew this was only the beginning. The nightmare was far from over, and the shadows of Jonestown would continue to haunt me. But now I had hope. Now I had a chance to fight back. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling with emotion. The woman's smile faded, replaced by a look of sadness. "I was one of them like you, but now I'm something more. I'm here to help you, to guide you. But you must be strong. There are more trials ahead." I nodded, my resolve hardening. "I understand." The woman looked at me for a long moment, then slowly began to fade, her form dissolving into the air like mist. "Remember," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "you are not alone." And then she was gone. I stood in the clearing, alone once more. But this time I felt different. Strong, ready. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something strange. Carved into the ground at my feet, in letters large and jagged, were the words, "It's not over. Asterisk, asterisk." A chill ran down my spine as I realized that whatever darkness had claimed Jonestown wasn't done with me yet. Not by a long shot. The words, "It's not over," echoed in my mind, a haunting reminder that the nightmare was far from finished. I stood frozen in the clearing, the darkness of the jungle pressing in on all sides. The ground beneath me seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if the earth itself was trying to swallow me whole. I forced myself to move, each step feeling like I was trudging through molasses. My mind raced with questions. Who is that woman? How had she managed to push back the darkness, even if only temporarily? And most importantly, what was still lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike? As I made my way back through the jungle, the air grew thick and heavy, a tangible weight pressing down on my chest. The trees loomed above me like towering sentinels, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, blocking out what little light remained. The path seemed endless, winding deeper into the heart of the jungle, leading me further from any hope of escape. A sudden rustling in the bushes snapped me out of my thoughts. I stopped, my heart pounding in my ears as I strained to listen. The sound was faint, barely perceptible, but it was there. A soft, rhythmic thumping, like the distant beat of a drum. It seemed to be coming from all around me, growing louder with each passing second. Fear clawed at my throat as I realized the sound wasn't just coming from the jungle. It was coming from beneath the ground. I hesitated, unsure whether to move forward or stay put. The woman's warning echoed in my mind. "You are not alone. Asterisk, asterisk." She had helped me before, but now I was on my own. Whatever was out there, whatever was waiting, I had to face it alone. The drumming grew louder, more insistent, vibrating through the earth beneath my feet. I could feel it in my bones, a deep, primal rhythm that resonated with something dark and ancient. It was as if the very soul of Jonestown was awakening, the spirits of the dead rising from their graves to confront the one who had escaped. I steeled myself, taking a deep breath before pushing forward. The path seemed to narrow, the trees closing in until I was forced to squeeze through the tight spaces between them. The air grew colder, my breath fogging in the sudden chill. The drumming was deafening now, a relentless pounding that threatened to drive me mad. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the drumming stopped. I stumbled into a small clearing, gasping for breath as the silence pressed in around me. The ground was bare, the earth cracked and dry, as if no life had ever touched this place. But what drew my attention was the structure in the center of the clearing. A crude altar, made of rough-hewn stone, its surface stained with dark, dried blood. I approached it cautiously, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to run. But something compelled me to move forward, a force beyond my control, pulling me toward the altar. As I reached it, I saw that the stone was engraved with symbols, twisted, arcane markings that seemed to shift and writhe as I looked at them. The air around me grew colder still, the silence so absolute that it was suffocating. And then I felt it, a presence, dark and malevolent, watching me from the shadows. A voice, deep, guttural, and filled with an ancient malice, whispered in my ear, "You should never have returned." I spun around, but there was no one there. The shadows around the clearing seemed to deepen, the trees closing in, their branches stretching out like claws. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, and the ground beneath me began to tremble. And then, I saw them. Figures emerging from the darkness, their bodies twisted and broken, their faces contorted in expressions of agony. They were the dead of Jonestown, the souls who had perished on that terrible day, now risen from their graves to confront the one who had escaped. But they weren't alone. Behind them, towering above the trees, was something far more terrifying. A massive, shadowy figure, its form shifting and amorphous, like a living darkness. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed with a sickly, unnatural light, and its mouth opened in a silent scream that echoed through the clearing. The ground beneath me cracked and split open, revealing a gaping abyss filled with writhing shadows. The figures of the dead moved closer, their hands outstretched, their eyes empty and soulless. I could feel the pull of the abyss, the darkness drawing me in, threatening to swallow me whole. Desperation clawed at my throat as I tried to back away, but the ground beneath me gave way and I stumbled, nearly falling into the abyss. The shadowy figure loomed above me, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. "You belong to us," the voice whispered, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from all around me. "You will never leave this place." I fought to stay on solid ground, my hands gripping the rough stone of the altar. But the darkness was relentless, the pull of the abyss too strong. The dead reached out to me, their cold, lifeless fingers brushing against my skin, sending shivers of terror down my spine. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her, the woman from before, standing at the edge of the clearing, her hand glowing with that same soft, ethereal light. Her expression was calm, but her eyes were filled with determination. "You must fight!" she called out, her voice cutting through the darkness like a blade. "You can break the cycle, you can escape, but how?" The abyss was too strong, the darkness too overwhelming. I could feel myself slipping, the shadows closing in, ready to consume me. "Remember what I told you," the woman said, her voice firm. "Let go of the past, forgive yourself. You must sever the ties that bind you to this place." Her words struck a chord deep within me, a realization dawning on me with terrifying clarity. I had been holding on to the guilt, the fear, the anger for so long that it had become a part of me, a chain that kept me bound to this nightmare. But I didn't have to be. I could break free. I could live. With a surge of determination, I reached deep within myself, gathering every ounce of strength I had left. I focused on the memories of that day, the horror, the pain, the loss. But instead of letting them consume me, I faced them head on. I acknowledged them, accepted them, and finally, let them go. The ground beneath me began to solidify, the pull of the abyss weakening. The dead hesitated, their grasp on me loosening, their expressions shifting from anger to confusion. The shadowy figure above me let out a roar of fury, its form shifting and writhing as it tried to regain control. But it was too late. The woman's light grew brighter, cutting through the darkness, forcing it back. And then, with a final, desperate scream, the shadowy figure dissolved, the darkness dissipating like smoke in the wind. The dead vanished, their forms fading into the ether, leaving me alone in the clearing. I collapsed to the ground, my body trembling, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The altar was gone, the symbols erased from the earth. The jungle around me was still, peaceful, as if the nightmare had finally ended. But as I lay there, exhausted and relieved, I knew deep down that it wasn't over. The darkness had retreated, but it hadn't been defeated. It was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. And I knew that when that moment came, I would have to face it again. Only this time, I would be ready. The jungle was eerily silent as I sat in the clearing, my breath still heavy from the ordeal. The darkness had receded, but the weight of what I had just experienced lingered in the air. I had confronted the shadows of Jonestown, faced the spirits of the dead, and somehow survived. But the woman's final words echoed in my mind, a haunting reminder that it wasn't truly over. I didn't know how much time had passed, minutes, hours, maybe even days. The concept of time seemed meaningless in this place, where the past and present bled into each other, and reality was just a thin veil over something much darker. My body ached. My mind was exhausted. But a nagging feeling deep in my gut told me that there was one last thing I had to do before I could leave this place for good. I rose to my feet, my legs trembling beneath me, and turned my gaze toward the heart of the jungle. The path that had once been closed off now lay open before me, the dense foliage parting to reveal a narrow trail leading deeper into the shadows. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to leave this place behind, but something pulled me forward, an invisible force drawing me toward the final confrontation. With each step, the air grew colder, the light dimming until I was once again surrounded by darkness. The trees seemed to close in around me, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. But I pressed on, driven by a determination that I couldn't fully explain. I had come this far, and there was no turning back now. The path wound through the jungle, twisting and turning, until I found myself standing before a familiar sight, the ruins of the main pavilion, where it had all begun. But this time, the pavilion was different. The decay and overgrowth were gone, replaced by a pristine structure that looked just as it had on that fateful day. The sight sent a shiver down my spine. It was as if time had reversed itself, bringing the horrors of the past back to life. The pavilion was filled with people, men, women, and children, all of them standing in eerie silence, their faces blank and expressionless. They were waiting, as if frozen in time, for something, or someone. And then I saw him. Jim Jones stood at the front of the pavilion, just as I remembered him. His dark glasses hid his eyes, but I could feel his gaze on me, cold and calculating. He held a microphone in one hand, his voice ringing out across the clearing with that same charismatic power that had once drawn so many to their deaths. "You came back," he said, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I knew you would." I clenched my fists, anger and fear boiling up inside me. "I had to. This has to end." Jones chuckled, a low mocking sound that sent chills down my spine. "End? There is no end. Jonestown is eternal, a paradise beyond the pain of this world. You could have been a part of it, but you ran. You abandoned your brothers and sisters." "I didn't abandon them," I shot back, my voice trembling with emotion. "I survived, and I've carried the weight of that survival every day since." Jones tilted his head as if considering my words. "Survived?" he repeated, his tone dripping with disdain. "Do you call this survival? You've been living in a prison of your own making, haunted by the ghosts of the past, unable to move on. You're just as trapped as the rest of us." His words cut deep, but I refused to let them break me. "Maybe I've been trapped," I admitted, my voice steadying. "But I'm not anymore. I faced the darkness, the guilt, the fear, and I'm ready to let it go. I'm ready to live." Jones's smile faltered, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his expression. "You think you can just walk away from this? From me?" His voice grew harsh, filled with an underlying menace. "You are Jonestown. You carry us with you in your heart and your soul. You can never leave." The people in the pavilion began to stir, their heads turning slowly to face me, their eyes vacant and lifeless. The air grew thick with tension, the atmosphere charged with an unseen force that pressed down on me from all sides. The shadows around the pavilion deepened, the darkness creeping closer, threatening to swallow me whole. But I stood my ground, refusing to be intimidated. "I'm not afraid of you," I said, my voice firm. "Not anymore." Jones's expression darkened, his calm facade slipping away to reveal the true nature of the man behind the glasses. His eyes, once hidden, now burned with a fiery intensity, filled with a hatred that sent a jolt of fear through me. "You should be," he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." The ground beneath me began to tremble, the earth cracking and splitting open to reveal the same gaping abyss I had seen before. The people in the pavilion began to move, their bodies jerking and contorting as they were drawn toward the chasm, their faces twisted in expressions of fear and despair. Jones raised his hands, his voice rising in a fevered pitch. "You think you can escape? There is no escape! We are eternal! We are one!" The darkness surged forward, a tidal wave of shadows and despair, crashing over me with a force that knocked the breath from my lungs. I was thrown to the ground, the world spinning around me as the abyss yawned open, ready to consume me. But even as the darkness closed in, I felt a spark of light within me, a warmth that pushed back against the cold. The woman's words echoed in my mind. "You must sever the ties that bind you to this place." Asterisk, asterisk. I reached deep within myself, grasping for that spark of light, that sliver of hope. I thought of the people who had died here, the friends and loved ones I had lost, and the guilt that had weighed me down for so long. But I also thought of the strength I had found, the determination to live, to honor their memory by moving forward. With a cry of defiance, I rose to my feet, the light within me growing brighter, pushing back the darkness. The shadows recoiled, hissing and writhing as they tried to consume me, but I refused to be overwhelmed.
"You don't control me!"
I shouted, my voice ringing out across the clearing.
"I control my own fate. I decide what happens to me, not you."
The darkness around me faltered, the abyss beginning to close as the light within me grew stronger. The people in the pavilion stopped their march toward the chasm, their expressions softening, the vacant look in their eyes fading. Jones screamed in rage, his voice a twisted, demonic roar that shook the very ground beneath us. He lunged at me, his form shifting and contorting into a monstrous shape, a creature of pure darkness and hatred. But I stood my ground, the light within me blazing like a beacon, repelling his advance. With a final furious cry, Jones was consumed by the light, his form disintegrating into nothingness, the shadows dissolving around him. The abyss closed, the ground solidifying beneath my feet, and the pavilion, once a place of death and despair, was bathed in a warm golden light. The people who had been trapped there, their spirits bound by the darkness, began to fade, their faces peaceful, free at last from the torment that had held them captive. I watched as they disappeared one by one until the pavilion was empty, the clearing silent and still. I stood there for a long moment, my heart pounding in my chest, the weight of what had just happened slowly sinking in. The nightmare was over. Jonestown was no more. But as I turned to leave, a faint whisper brushed against my ear, sending a shiver down my spine. "It's not over. Asterisk, asterisk." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I looked around, but there was nothing. Just the empty jungle, the warm light of the clearing fading as the sun began to set. But the whisper lingered, a dark promise that sent a chill through my bones. I had survived Jonestown, but I knew that the darkness would always be a part of me, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to return. As I walked away from the clearing, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't truly alone. The shadows of Jonestown would follow me, haunt me, but I was determined to live. I had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, but the battle was far from over. And somewhere, deep in the heart of the jungle, the echoes of Jonestown remained, waiting for the next soul to stumble upon its cursed ground, to be drawn into the endless cycle of death and despair. But for now I was free. Or at least I hoped I was. The end.